Miles, welcome to Time Team from Bournemouth University or wherever your back bedroom is at the moment.
I've moved downstairs now, so
You moved downstairs. Oh, very nice, very nice. It's very nice to have you along, and I wanted to ask you some critical questions. We're drawing nearer to the possibility of excavating this 80-meter long Roman villa. And I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, if this was a site you were about to go into, where would you start? But more importantly, what would you be hoping to get out of it? In other words, if there's a chance, I remember Guy saying, this is one of my interminably long questions, I'm afraid. I've worked myself up and get going.
There you go.
I remember Guy de la Bedouin said at some point, he said, we're never going to find any new Roman history books or any new documents. We pretty much think we've got them. So finding new stuff about the Romans is going to come from archaeology. So if you had a shot at an 80-meter long Roman villa in Oxfordshire, what would you be hoping to get out of it over maybe a number of years of seasons of work and things like that?
I mean, I think the key thing really, archaeologically speaking, is with a lot of villas is that we know where they spent their money. You know, we can see the mosaics and the wall plaster and everything, but we can't see how they made their money. And all the antiquarian excavations from about the 1800s up until the mid 20th century have always focused on the big house. And nice though the big house is, and I think it's always important to put a trench across the big house to see how well it is preserved, because mosaics are, you know, unique pieces of art. But in the bigger picture, it's the farmyards, it's the areas beyond the villa that really need examination. Because, I mean, although every single villa is unique, you know, it's not like a fort whereby it's the Roman state building the same thing again and again and again and again across the landscape. Villas develop over time and they evolve and they change. So it's, you know, everyone is different, but I think, you know, usually with a geophysical survey and with a good understanding, you can see the area that's often enclosed around the villa, the farmyard area. And the thing about the Romans were they like to show off where their money came from. You know, from the limited number of villas that have been excavated beyond the main house, you often, as you approach it, you would go through the farmyard, you'd have pigsties, you've had cattle sheds and so on. You know, whereas perhaps an 18th century stately home, they would hide all that. You know, you'd bulldoze the peasant village and you'd sort of landscape the area around. But Romans, as far as we can see, like to show off, here's where I made my money and here's where I spent it. And we found so many examples of where they spent it. But it's the outer areas. You know, are they generating money through rearing cattle? Have they got sheep pens? Have they got some other kind of industrial or agricultural complex around the big house?
And I suppose the other alternative, Miles, is that this family made their money from, say, pottery production, from the Oxford pottery wares, or from working in Cirencester. I mean, it's 40 miles away, I think Helen told me. And but were they working in the administration? Were they making their money from taxation and being a core part of the local administration?
Absolutely, yeah. So you might well find evidence, you know, of that sort of industrial activity around the villa. So it's that area. But beyond that as well, I mean, it depends how big a survey you can do. And obviously the bigger the better, because early surveys were, again, just focused on the big house. So often when you get a plan of a villa, you can say, even without digging it, you can say, there's the dining room, there's the bath block, there's there's the corridor. You can see how it all fits together. But what we don't often get is also the burial ground, the mausoleum, the temple, because we don't know who lived in those big sort of houses, because the burial ground's often set a long way off, sometimes, you know, on the main approach to the villa. So if you could find the burial ground of a temple, that is also adding massive amount of information. And that, you know, the temple might give us some kind of clue to the ethnicity of the owner, because there's no guarantee that the person living in a Romano British villa is actually of Romano British origin. They could come from anywhere in the Roman Empire and settling here. So, you know, that is another aspect, I think, that tends to be overlooked.
And we
But
know that we have got a sarcophagus from there.
excellent.
And that was found, it was the original reason, I think, the combination of that early sarcophagus find and then some work by a local archaeologist who took an interest in the site. And that's what that sort of combination of the sarcophagus and the work that Keith did, who we're working with, he's a metal detectorist, he's also a local archaeologist. That was very important to locating the site.
Excellent. I mean, often you do get isolated sarcophagus remains because they've been reused. They kind of get reused as cattle troughs or get reused in building. But if you can locate whereabouts that came from, I mean, that'd be fantastic. But to find the burial ground of the owners who lived in the villa, that would be a major discovery, you know, for Roman Britain, because so much has been focused on the house and not on the surrounding area. So, you know, that would, I think, be a major priority.
And during field walking, I think they did find tessera. They also found about 60 coins from a range of Roman emperors. And we're hoping to get Richard Rees to have a look at those for us. And I'm thinking of the early work we did with David Neal on mosaics. And I remember David saying to me, I saw mosaics 20 years ago, made a sketch of them in the field, and they're no longer there. You know, because you know it's there, it might be bad weather, climate change, soil conditions, some farming situation occurs, and a mosaic isn't necessarily going to be secure just because it's 4 or 5 inches below the soil.
No, not at all. And of course, again, mosaics are vitally important, really, because they're such a fragile art resource. Every mosaic is unique. And it's not like, you know, when you're mixing up bits of a jigsaw puzzle and you've got the image on the box, so you know what should be there. When the mosaic tessera come up, the image is going, and that also gives us so much of an idea of not just the artistic traditions of Roman Britain, but the kind of myths that the owner liked, because you often in their dining room area, what's there on the floor tells you more about them than anything else in the house. And of course, ploughing, we tend not to think of ploughing agriculture as destruction, as development. You know, it's not like a housing estate or a road. It's obviously destructive, but ploughing takes a couple of centimeters off every year. It goes down and down, and the destruction wrought upon mosaics is just horrific. So if you've got tessera on the surface, yeah, obviously that suggests that the mosaic has been disturbed, but it would be a priority to try and identify. I mean, you need to know obviously how it is surviving. Is it surviving? And any kind of idea of the artistic elements of it, because, you know, a lot of sites in the field, although you think they are preserved, they're not being destroyed. Ploughing is taking them apart bit by bit.
Yeah, and I remember too, when we had Dinnington, we had some bits of shattered tessera around, and it was almost like a rescue dig. By working in those areas, we eventually found one piece of the pattern, which I think had a gouache design. David Neal called it one of those sort of coiled rope looking designs.
Yes, or sort of guilloche, yeah, there's interlinking, yeah.
Yeah, and because we found a piece of it, he was able to extrapolate from that to a bigger picture. And I think there was a couple of images in there which were part of a myth he was able to reconstruct. So from a fragment of the mosaic, we were able to create the bigger picture. I think it was almost, you know, we could have said, okay, that mosaic has probably been destroyed. We'll move on to something else. But by persisting in that area, and in one sense, you're almost part of a rescue dig, aren't you, on a villa like this? If natural earth movement, farming back in the day, has done some damage already, we may be looking at the final remnants of the clue to that person, because, you know, he would have had a large mosaic possibly in, is it the triclinium, the sort of big dining room, the meeting hall?
It is, yeah, the triclinium. And the triclinium is usually the most obvious bit in the villa because it's usually the largest room, and it sometimes has an apse at the end because that's where everyone sits and eats stuffed dormice and gossips about the emperor. But the rest of the room in front of that will have a whole series of designs for the slaves or for entertainment. And what's in that floor, again, tells you about the literary and artistic tastes of the owner. Most of the mosaics in the triclinium often relate to Bacchus and drinking and sort of orgies and that kind of entertainment, because that's what the owner, wants his guests to be relaxed and to get drunk and to be entertained. But the sorts of scenes from mythology that are in that, that gives you a key to unlocking the mind of the owner.
And I wanted to sort of also ask you about the relationship between the owner, we know absolutely nothing at the moment. He's completely a blank slate, him and his family. We could estimate how many people would have occupied a villa of this size. I think it's probably North Lee is probably the nearest one. How many people can you imagine being inside a villa like this?
That's the great unknown, really, isn't it? That's the question we all like to answer. I mean, usually a villa, we'd expect a family. It might be two families. Sometimes villas have two bathing suites attached to them. And there's some debate as to whether one might be the family and one might be for visitors. But it could be you've got two families who've inherited an estate and they're both living in the same sort of block. But often with villas, you get that three sides of a square with domestic ranges in. But they would be attended by servants and or slaves. With the Roman villas in Britain, of course, we don't get a second floor surviving. We just got the ground level. And it could be that servants and slaves lived in the attic space or lived upstairs, which we don't get surviving. So we'd probably expect in a normal sized villa, you probably got somewhere between 20 and 30 people living within that sort of space. The key is always going to be whether it's continually occupied, because we know by historical analogy, some big estate owners have got 5 or 6 villas and they travel between them. And the one bit of the estate that's permanently occupied is sort of an ancillary building where the estate manager, the farm manager, may live in slightly less well-appointed accommodation. And the villa might just be swept clean and the baths heated up for when the owner and his or her family arrive. That might only be once or twice a year. So you might have a strange situation where the big house is empty for large blocks of the time, but only the building next door to it is permanently occupied. So, you might only be talking about 20 or 30 people at any one time in that kind of space. And it is often a vast space.
And I do remember when we did some work on a hypocaust, just what it required to keep a hypocaust and a hot bath going. You're talking about presumably slaves or workers who were having to chop down a considerable amount of wood to heat up the furnaces, to warm the floors, the walls, the water. And one of the things we've been thinking about is the whole water system, that I guess as a Roman in a villa like that, you would expect to have a bathhouse, running water through lead pipes, which was a Roman invention, a decent toilet block. I mean, water's critical, isn't it, really?
It is. And of course, the one thing about having your own private bathhouse, every town's got a public bath system, but you can't control who can access that. So you'll have everyone from different levels of society in there. And as far as we can see, most Roman baths don't have plugs. So they might have just been emptied with people by buckets emptying that. So you might end up in the public baths whereby it's like a human soup of horrific water. In your own baths, you can regulate who's using it. It can be relatively clean. The plunge bath might be quite small, but yeah, you absolutely need a lot of water to facilitate that. And you're right about the hypocaust, because experimental archaeology has shown just how long it takes to ignite and to heat and to keep those floors warm. And not every floor would have been in the villa would have had that, but certainly those like the main office and those in the warm rooms and the hot room in the bathhouse would need that. So a lot of servants facilitating that, and you say cutting down trees and just keeping it burning and keeping it regulated.
And I'm interested to think about, I don't know if my memory is right about this, but I've got a feeling that we had at least 3 of the great Roman emperors decided to visit Britain, this sort of backwoods part of the empire. Um, and I wonder what the relationship was between the family who owned this villa, these rich villa owners. Would they be conscious of the emperor? Would they have been automatically saying prayers to the emperor? What sort of relationship did an average Roman have with the big guy at the top whose head keeps appearing on the coins all the time?
Well, exactly. I mean, you would see the head on the coins, and you'd be reasonably aware of who was in charge. Towards the end of the empire, we're seeing again there's historical records of people who own villas in Britain and France and Spain and Greece. So they move; they're the big movers and shakers of the empire. They would know who was in charge, and they would probably be sort of up to their necks in sort of bribery and corruption just to stay, in that kind of position. But if you're living in a villa, however small it is, you're part of that Roman system. You understand the policy, even if you're just a local town councillor, in nearby Cirencester or wherever. You understand the system of government. You know that the governor is appointed by the emperor, so thereby you have got a connection to the big man and to the big family back in Rome. So, even an obscure part of the empire like in Oxfordshire, you would know the system and you'll be part of it. And you want to get noticed and you want to rise, but you don't want to get noticed so much that somebody sort of executes you on a trumped up charge and takes control of your villa. So it's a precarious game. Being rich and powerful in the Roman Empire is dangerous, and it all depends on your relationship to the guy at the top.
And there we have our villa in between some of the major routes of Roman Britain. You've got it's virtually a triangulation of Roman roads around it. And when I think of roads, I also think of taxation, because the Romans were quite keen on taxation and very efficient at it. They were appointed people who had the skills, and that must have produced loads of money.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're in a villa, you're a Roman citizen, and although you're protected by the law, you have to pay a tax. And really, from the time of Constantine at the beginning of the 4th century, they are doing audits all around the empire. They're working out who owns what land, how much land they own, therefore how much tax they have to pay. So the Roman bureaucratic system was incredibly detailed and complicated. But certainly the wealthy, I mean, that's one of the big complaints we hear about the Roman wealthy in the 5th centuries is they want to leave the empire because they feel they're paying far too much tax. They're paying to subsidize barbarians in other parts of the world. They're paying to prop up the frontier. They're paying for costly foreign wars. And they'd rather the money just stayed at home. But yeah, the tax collecting system in the Roman Empire, I think, far outstrips any kind of system we've got today. It was horrifically organised and arguably very unfair. But there you go. That's part of being Roman.
And unlike the kind of systems we have in the Norman period, where there's an attempt to get the record everybody and what they own, we don't particularly have any documents like that from the Roman period, or do we? Do we have some sort of idea of how that system worked and how they knew what had to be paid?
Yeah, we don't really have the system surviving that. There are certain parts of the Eastern Mediterranean where we do get fragmentary records from the 6th and 7th centuries. But we know that really the emperor, certainly Constantine, had a detailed record of how many people owned what blocks of land. It'd be fantastic if that was all survived. I mean, we've got lots of nice late military documents that gives us names of forts and garrisons and so on, like the Notitia Dignitatum. But we don't have the equivalent civilian record. That's it probably wasn't that interesting for people, it's not full of military insignia and badges and so on. So it wasn't copied into the medieval era. But we do know that such records did exist because they wanted to have an accurate idea of where the big landowners were so they could really hit them hard for taxation purposes.
And it's always a question I feel, I'd like an answer to is quite why they bothered with Britain. And one explanation I've read is that in a sense, all the Roman emperors wanted a victory. They wanted to crush, annihilate the forces of a distant power so that they would have a victory celebration back in Rome. And maybe Britain was regarded as that. But what on earth made them come into Britain, and then head towards Scotland, for goodness sake, building walls and hanging the empire out in the far north.
I think the thing is, you're right that the late Republic and the early Empire leaders needed a military victory, and certainly crushing barbarians is one of the main. Got this big fear about the barbarian North and the threat to civilization, and Britain is that fantastic goal because it's the other side of the ocean. So actually crossing the English Channel or the ocean to the Romans is a major achievement. And Julius Caesar tried it twice and got great political capital out of it, but he didn't achieve a lasting conquest. So when Claudius comes to the scene, it is the ideal target because to invade Britain makes you better than Julius Caesar. But having got control of Britain, it's sort of like, what are we going to do now? Because the prosperous southeast, the bit that they understood and traded with is one thing, but Britain extends far. You've got the mineral resources, you've got the tin and the lead to the West Country and the gold in Wales. But the further north in England, you get into pasture, you get into dispersed settlements, mountainous terrain, and Rome's no good at dealing with it. You can't generate money from that. So then, they're having to start building walls to say everything to the south is ours and everything to the north we don't really want. You can sort yourselves out. But it's having invested in Britain, you can't abandon it. All of Claudius's success, I think, like Nero after the Boudiccan revolt, looked to Britain and thought it'd be easy if we just let it go. But you can't, because the propaganda significance of Britain is great. To let it go, it will just be disastrous. So you've got to hold on to it determinedly, but it's a feeling that at certain times Britain was a massive drain on resources. I mean, it did generate tin and lead and gold and agriculture resources, but it took a lot of the military to keep it under control.
I was looking at a book about Rome and Oxfordshire. When Rome was collapsing or when they were withdrawing people from Britain, people were still building these amazing villas. There was like a golden age of villas while Rome was burning.
Absolutely. I mean, the National Trust excavations at Chedworth recently have shown that there still looks like there's mosaics still being laid well into the 5th century. Britain is being cut off by Rome in AD 410, but in the 420s, 30s, 40s, people are still putting mosaics down. So I think it's that area of the Cotswolds around Cirencester, Gloucester, and over towards Oxford, which you've got the big villas, you've got a lot of money, you've got a lot of power. And to some extent, they're kept away from all the big problems of the later Roman world. They're not massively affected by barbarian invasions. They're away from the frontier. And whoever's still there is still holding on to their wealth and is probably still farming in much the sort of way they used to. And of course, it's interesting, all the stories of sort of Ambrosius, Aurelianus and Arthur beginning that part of the world. I think that's where you've got your late and post-Roman sort of farmers or sort of wealthy, and they've got their own little private armies to protect those resources. So that's sort of where the origins of those myths really begin, is in that part of the world.
I like the idea that, essentially they were probably calling on areas outside Oxfordshire for military support, because we've got Cirencester where there was a fort, but relatively speaking, around the area we're talking about, I don't think there are that many fort sites, or they haven't been found yet anyway. It's almost like they didn't quite need them there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got all the shore forts around the south and east of Britain protecting the English Channel and the North Sea. You've got forts and fortresses in the west of Wales protecting against the Irish Sea. But there's no real significant military activity in the later Roman world in that, in the Cotswolds. So if you're talking about armies, then a lot of it may well be sort of mercenaries or ex-units of the military, or you're bringing in Germanic warriors, Saxons, Frisians, and so on, and you're actually paying for them to protect you. So the sort of military activity that we see in late Roman Britain in the Cotswolds is very, very, it mostly comprises spears and in burials and belt buckles. You can see it's really a sort of a private security firm that are protecting the landowners in that part of the world.
And of course, it was a private security firm that, if legend has it, sort of began turning on the Romans, or realizing that Britain was ripe for attack. And those, I think is it Federati?
Yes, it is. Yeah, the Federati. it's a classic late Roman idea, or to fill gaps in the military. The barbarians want to come in, therefore you invite them in, you give them land, but you take their young men to serve in the equivalent of the Roman military. And that seems to be, so the legend goes, that's what's happening in Britain, with a number of Germanic groups being settled in Kent as a sort of, here's your land, here's your territory, but you will now protect us from other different threats to the north, and possibly against the Irish tribes. But according to sort of Gildas and Bede and the early medieval writers, that's where Saxon England begins, in that part of Kent, because they overrun their masters and take control.
It's interesting, isn't it, Miles, that, all archaeology, I mean, you and I know that there's archaeological units at universities under threat. Archaeology finds it difficult to get funds, and fundamentally there's this dichotomy between the need to keep the public interested and therefore supporting archaeology, and the need to do a whole range of archaeological work, some of which is essential but not exactly thrilling. So you need your Staffordshire hoard, you need your Prittlewell burial, you need your Chedworth mosaics, you even need a visit from Tutankhamun, everybody remembers, to show people that there's this brilliant, exciting subject here, even though it requires a lot of work that isn't necessarily, and it's a difficult balance to get. And a mosaic in the middle of a villa, where does that stand in that argument?
I mean, I think, a mosaic in the middle of a villa, especially one like this, where we've got no idea of what it's going to be like, what's actually there. It hasn't been touched before. None of it's been recorded before. I mean, there's nothing like a floor level. I mean, there's always a problem with timber structures is often trying to work out where your clay level, where your floor is. But in a Roman villa, you've got that mosaic, you've got the floor level. This is where people stood 2,000 years ago. And you've got that unique art preserved in there that links you straight back to the Mediterranean world. I mean, that's just fantastic. Nothing, I think for me, that is the most exciting find that you could get from an archaeological site.
And you don't feel at all shy, embarrassed by colleagues who might say, you're going after the shiny and not the useful.
No, I think, a mosaic, it's a unique work of art. And I think leaving it in the ground, it's going to get destroyed. We're going to lose all that information. So for the rest of the villa, I think by and large, you don't necessarily have to excavate that. But a trench across the dining room is absolutely vital, because if to lose a unique masterpiece from the ancient world, I think it would just be criminal. We have to understand what it is we're preserving. You have to understand, you have to see that mosaic to really get that link with the past.
Miles, thank you very much. Best wishes to Bournemouth University. We're hoping we'll have a few of your colleagues along with us for the first shoot anyway, and we'd love you to get you along to visit the site as it gets going.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
And I think it's very useful that the Time Team family of Romanists, as you know, it's great to have your thoughts and advice at this stage, and we'll be keeping in touch with you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Miles.
Cheers.
We can't do any of this work without you, so please subscribe, back us on Patreon, and make sure that Time Team comes back again.